This podcast is brought to you by Sydney Health Partners, Maridulu, Budyari, Gumal, the Sydney Partnership for Health, Education, Research and Enterprise, and New South Wales Regional Health Partners. We support our partner organisations to deliver high-quality clinical trials for the benefit of patient health and ongoing medical research.
Clinical trial audits can be undertaken by internal or external auditors at any time throughout the conduct of a clinical trial. Audits seek evidence that the trial meets agreed standards for the handling of data, the consenting and screening of patients, good clinical practice, and much, much more. An audit can be initiated for a range of reasons, including a sponsor's audit or an ethics committee audit. You may also have heard of the National Clinical Trials Governance Framework. It was developed by the Australian Commission for Quality and Safety in Healthcare as the first step towards a nationally consistent approach to the accreditation of health services conducting clinical trials. Under the framework, if a clinical trial doesn't meet the required standards, there could be implications for the ongoing accreditation of that health service. A failure to meet the standards reviewed in an audit has real implications, such as a clinical trial being temporarily or even permanently suspended at a site. If, as a researcher or a clinical trialist, you're unsure about your governance, systems and processes, now is the time to be thinking about how you can be audit ready. Hi, I'm Rebeka Freckleton and I'm the Research Strategy and Partnerships Manager at Northern Sydney Local Health District. In this podcast, I'll be talking about being audit ready, and joining me for the discussion are Rosemary Carroll, a clinical nurse consultant in surgical research at John Hunter Hospital in Newcastle, and Robert Kent, Research Operations Manager at the Kinghorn Cancer Centre in Sydney. Hi Rosemary and Rob, thanks for being here today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rebeka.
So audits, as you both know, are a requirement of the National Statement on Ethical Conduct in Research and of Good Clinical Practice, and they're often a contractual requirement in clinical trials agreements with our sponsors. Rob, how do you explain the difference to people between monitoring and auditing?
Well, monitoring is an ongoing quality assurance process where we can make sure the trials are running smoothly throughout the lifetime of the trial, whereas audit is an independent snapshot of process and often takes in multiple areas, including the ethics, the hospital, the sponsor and the site.
And what is the role of an audit? Are there any different types of audits, like a sponsor audit or auditing for the national framework?
Well, from my perspective, an audit is very much about making sure a unit for a particular trial may have all their I's dotted and their T's crossed, particularly in relation to ethical issues, compliance to your standard operating procedures, compliance to good clinical practice, ensuring that you have a well-trained unit, and ultimately that it's about the protection of the patient.
We found that they actually will trigger audits, especially if you're a very high recruiting site. If your data looks a bit suspicious, there's lots of reasons that can trigger it, and they can also use it in lieu of a regular monitoring visit. So if you are a successful site, you can expect to get audited.
Wow, it's certainly becoming more complex, isn't it? And look, I think in spite of the general desire we've got in health for continuous improvement, audits are perceived to be quite scary, especially for the staff that work quite closely to them. But I don't think they necessarily have to be. Rosemary, can you give me any examples of how the audit process can drive trial and site improvements and lead to, I guess, positive outcomes?
I think in any clinical trial that you should have at the very beginning a system for which you manage your trial in terms of file storage, versioning, and that should all be contained in your standard operating procedures. And if you are consistent with your approach of managing trials, when you get notified of an upcoming audit, you should be able to pull that together because you know that you have a well-trained team and that you should be all doing everything the same way. It does take time to get things together. You would hope you'd have at least 2 to 4 weeks to be able to do that and book a room and have everyone around on the day that they need to be there, because auditors will want to see the PI and speak with them, the trial manager, and you usually have intimate knowledge of your trial and how things are going. If you do detect any issues, you can discuss them as a group before the auditors arrive, so that if they notice that issue, you can address that at the time, or you can remedy that issue before they arrive. So it does take time, but if you've got good processes in place and follow your SOPs, then you should be good to go.
Rob, do you have any examples of how the audit process has driven positive outcomes at the site?
Oh, absolutely. Audits have become increasingly common over the many years I've been working in research, and they've helped us drive out the quality of the outputs that our centre can achieve. And we've seen the external eyes looking at what we're doing and providing us with questions bring to light how we can improve it. So it's helped us drive improvements in our standard operating procedures and our processes, and it makes everything simpler for the next audit.
I think that audits can be perceived as terrifying by the people that work around them, and there's this sense, that the whole of the audit outcome is on your head. But Rob, there are some examples of cases where audits have led to really positive outcomes for the site. Can you give any examples that come to mind?
Absolutely. Audits can be scary, and for some sites it should be scary. But for when you are actively working to improve your processes, to find an independent set of eyes to look at what you do, give you some advice, can help you drive the quality and make future audits a much, much more confident in future audits.
Yeah, I think that's true. It can still be a bit scary. And I think, we've talked a little bit about how they can lead to improvement, but it's also reasonable to say that there's a bit of variation in the readiness of sites. And of course, it's really helpful to have notice. And the more notice, the better if you're about to be audited. But what do you think sites can do if they are aware that they might need to do a little bit more preparation, or they haven't been involved in a lot of audits, to make sure that they're as ready as they can be?
Well, I think you usually get notice of what particular patients that they're going to be auditing, and also if they're doing it on a patient-by-patient basis. But sometimes there can be a surprise audit as well, and that's happened to me. So I actually find monitoring visits much more nerve-wracking than auditing, because they're looking at specific data, and if someone's written the wrong thing in the notes, then that can have a flow-on effect. But in terms of auditing, I think having everybody consistently doing the same thing, so that no matter what patient you go to, everything should be there. That won't always happen, of course, because we're humans involved, error will occur. But I almost have like an in-house process ourselves, where you're often looking at your files and making sure that every document that you know will be required is present, whether it's a hard copy file or an electronic file, as we're tending to do nowadays. Everything is electronic, and trying to keep on top of the paperwork, whether it be hard copy or not, is hard work, because you get so many replies from Regis these days, and saving everything is a nightmare.
And I think it is the fact that you can have these spontaneous audits that really pushes you to have regular training at your site, so the staff are prepared at any time to receive an auditor and know how to deal with it differently to a normal monitoring visit.
Yes, absolutely. I would agree. And I think each person needs to have a very detailed knowledge of the processes and what the expectations of the unit that they are employed in. And part of that is on the orientation is vitally important. Well-trained staff, making sure they're up to date with their GCP and any changes in in-house processes. And there will always be an issue. I think we have to accept that, but let's hope it's a minor issue and not a major.
So it sounds like rather than being something you prepare for in the 2 weeks prior, it's an ongoing kind of process of making sure that you're organised and you're ready if there is going to be an audit.
I think so. Would you say that, Rob?
Absolutely. I think if you can get some really good quality assurance within your own department to make sure that you're following standards with expected timelines, you can be ready for those spontaneous audits at any time.
Yeah.
And I think as a unit that does predominantly investigator-initiated research, so we're designing, conducting, analysing and writing up our own research, that you need to have perhaps a set of outside eyes from your trial unit come and oversee your processes and check that you are actually towing the line when it comes to compliance with your standard operating procedures and good clinical practice and New South Wales health policies and directives and your local policy compliance procedures for research.
What are the implications of a poor outcome from an audit?
Well, I think there's an element of disappointment in maybe something's not gone right in your department, and so you need to address that within your department, but also you need to address it for the sponsor or whoever conducted the audit and be able to show what your investigation has found, a cause, a remedy to whatever the particular issue was. And it's not about picking out a particular person and a blame game at all. It's about systems and processes that may have failed in some way.
I don't think it'd be very nice to have a poor outcome, but I'm sure it happens more often than people talk about.
Rebeka, for a negative finding for an audit and to have major issues, it slurs, I suppose, the reputation of the principal investigator of this trial and the staff who work on that trial. It can have implications for your trial site. You may lose studies. You don't want to get a reputation as being a poor quality clinical trial site. You want to maintain the integrity of your site and have sponsors come to your site wanting you to do projects with them. So it could have financial implications, reputation implications. What do you think, Rob?
And jail.
Oh, yes, of course. Research fraud still happens worldwide.
Yeah, but I find that generally if you have the intention, good intentions in research, the benefits of all audits outweigh the risks. But it is open to finding out what's going on at your site. And the reputation of your site is transmitted amongst the people who are investing in research and will increase the likelihood of you getting access to more treatments for your patients.
Yeah, very good point.
So, Rob, knowing the implications of a poor audit and knowing that everyone on every side, of course, wants to avoid that, what do you think a trial unit needs to do to make sure they're ready for an audit?
Well, I mean, different sites have, due to capacity, have the ability to self-monitor or get external monitors in. But I think it's really important to have very strong pathways to quality check your own work, measure yourself against other centres, whether that's just visiting other centres, getting their experiences and sharing information with other centres, and just education so that when you do have an audit, the different way you handle that process, your staff are not the nervous, scared, because all those are triggers to auditors to look further, and you don't want to be that person.
And what happens after the audit? What happens then?
There's several parts of the audit that you'll have a chance to interact with your auditor, and there's always a start-up meeting and a close-out meeting, and I find it's really important to be part of that process. So at the close-out, you'll have an opportunity to look at the initial interim findings. They'll often bring up the major findings, and you have a chance to explain yourself. So if you can be part of that, you can actually diffuse any of the major findings before they get written down into a final report. But at the end, you'll get often 5 or 6 pages, and there is no way around not having findings. So it lets you work through it, respond back to them individually, and actually either push back against what they're saying about your site or help implement, whether it's file notes or process or SOPs. You can actually put in place a higher standard of process that will help you in the future.
So there are some positive outcomes then from even the responses that auditors provide. You mentioned before, Rob, that being nervous isn't a great look when there's an auditor around, and it can sometimes lead to them looking a little bit more closely. Based on your experience, are there any other tips or tricks that you'd want to share?
Yeah, look, I think you have to look at the focus of what that person is trying to achieve. They're there to be the most suspicious person they can be. And they're going to look at you, and if you withhold information, if you suggest other problems that have happened in other trials, that will trigger them to look further than the trial that they actually came for. So the best thing is to be transparent, be simple, don't be overly friendly. People who are overly friendly, they get suspicious of as well, and they will start to look deeper at your work in particular. So it's always just be professional, be polite, provide them with everything they need, and then at the end, they will then probably relax, and you can actually have a discussion around what they found and how to improve your process.
So not too nice, not too nervous, professional. Is there anything, Rosemary, that you'd add in your experience?
I think most auditors like to be left alone. So after the initial, here's the notes or here's how you access the notes, here's our trial master file, that they will then just want to be left alone to go through things. And I think you can make it a bit easier if you do have a paper file. You can flag your approvals, research governance, authorisation, amendments, correspondence, so that you make it easier for them. And I think they'll appreciate the effort. but not be suspicious of your motivations. Often they'll call you in to ask a question and you answer it and you leave. They don't like you hanging around. So provision of sustenance helps, I think. That's often an expectation of auditors and monitors. So I suppose you need to make them comfortable and have appropriate facilities, and I think that's just being professional.
So the way to an auditor is through their stomach. I don't know, Rob, what do you think?
No. Well, I mean, there are different levels, and I do know when I've had some of the bigger companies send orders, you don't offer them a glass of water. They'll ask what they want, and if you offer them anything, they look at that as trying to sway their opinion of you.
It's a shame it's a bit of an adversarial process, isn't it?
To start with. But they have to do that role. It's an important role. It makes your work better. It makes the data better and safer for our patients.
Clinical trials will come into focus in our hospital system as part of the National Clinical Trials Governance Framework that will commence in 2022. The difference or the change is that clinical trials will become part of the standard 3-year accreditation process that all hospitals currently have to go through, but which research has never been a part of. And now clinical trials will be absorbed into that process. Rob, you've been through the pilot for that. Can you tell us what your experience was in that process?
Sure. While our research is very highly regulated, this is the first time that our accreditation is coming up and is being integrated into the health system. So we went through the same kind of qualities, looking at our processes, looking at the expiry date on the curtains. It looked at the range of processes. It went through the ethics committee, look at their process, the way we communicated. It wanted to talk to our patients. It was very straightforward. It was very simple, but I think the main part of being incorporated into this as part of the larger health system is that the ethics committees and other committees will now have a responsibility to meet their own standards to oversee what we do.
And how did that audit differ from other audits that you've been through?
It wasn't an audit as such. It was an accreditation that looked at our processes. They read some of our audit reports. And it will trigger audits in the future because it makes the governance departments and the ethics committee departments, it makes them have a process for auditing our department, which was not there formally. They had aspired over many years to audit, but now it will be part of the metric that they need to be recognised as part of the hospital accreditation.
So it sounds like it's something that's going to increase the work for our governance teams at every site as well. Rob and Rosemary, we've discussed some really fascinating points today, and I think it's been really useful for our listeners. Is there any final points that you'd like to make before we finish?
Thanks, Rebeka. I'd just like to say that everything you do and every day you work in research should be aiming at being ready for an audit. So systems and processes in place.
And I think audits are something that should be embraced. I think they're an opportunity for your centre to improve your process, to improve the safety of your patients, and to demonstrate what you're doing, the quality of what you're doing.
Thanks, Rosemary and Rob. It's been a great discussion and I think our listeners will find it useful.
Thanks, Rebeka.
Thank you.
If you would like to know more about being audit ready, you can now find some handy resources on the websites of Sydney Health Partners, Maridulu, Budyari, Gumal, Sphere, and New South Wales Regional Health Partners. Together, the three organisations have produced a presentation explaining the concepts of clinical trials audits and good clinical practice, an audit visit checklist and guidelines for developing standard operating procedures for external clinical trial audits. You can find links to these in the description of this podcast. I'm Rebeka Freckleton. Thanks for listening.